Hello and howdy, folks. I'm very excited to have all this equipment set up and working. Hopefully, I will be able to transfer this over to the Instagram account. I have no idea how I'm going to do that yet, but hey, University of YouTube. So I just got off a 72-hour fast, which was awesome. It's the second time I've done it. I did it also about a year ago. And while I was on the fast, I got a lot of reading done by a couple of my favorites, Plutarch of Rome and also Seneca. Seneca, what a character. I'm not going to get much into his backdrop. Maybe I'll do that on another occasion, but he was an individual that helped me quite a bit, sort of the father that I never had. And I came into him about a year and a half ago after I had had a large struggle with my family, and of course, naturally, I really wanted to blame them. And Seneca helped me realize that the fault was actually mine, as is often the case when we're dealing with the world, because we don't see the world how it is, we see the world how we are. And though I'd come to accept myself as sort of a philosopher type, I also had this identity in me that was stuck in me from childhood and onward, that was really sort of punk rock, flying the face of society. And I'd adopted that principle as a personal philosophy for my entire mostly my entire life, really, back even all the way to middle school, probably. And it was reading book 5 in Seneca's moral letters to Lucilius that really helped me clarify that principle and adopt and reform myself into a better principle. And it is the book I would like to share with you today. It takes about 5 minutes or so for me to read it. And then when I'm done reading it, I'm just going to go over a couple passages and call it a day. And if I get time to read book 7, I'll do that too, but in another broadcast. So this is letter 5 from Moral Letters to Lucilius, and it's called The Philosopher's Mean, and by which Seneca is trying to explain the way the philosopher should live his life. And I really enjoy it. I hope you do too. We're going to start off right now. The Philosopher's Mean. I view with pleasure and approval the way you keep on at your studies and sacrifice everything to your single-minded efforts to make yourself every day a better man. I do not merely urge you to persevere in this. I actually implore you to. Let me give you, though, this one piece of advice. Refrain from following the example of those whose craving is for attention, not their own improvement, by doing certain things which are calculated to give rise to comment on your appearance or way of living generally. Avoid shabby attire, long hair, an unkempt beard, an outspoken dislike of silverware, sleeping on the ground, and all other misguided means of self-advertisement. The very name of philosophy, however modest the manner in which it is pursued, is unpopular enough as it is. Imagine what the reaction would be if we started disassociating ourselves from the conventions of society. Inwardly, everything should be different, but our outward face should conform with the crowd. Our clothes should not be gaudy, yet they should not be dowdy either. We should not keep silver plate with inlays of solid gold, but at the same time we should not imagine that doing without gold and silver is proof that we are leading the simple life. Let our aim be a way of life not diametrically opposed to, but better than, that of the mob. Otherwise we shall repel and alienate the very people whose reform we desire. We shall make them, moreover, reluctant to imitate us in anything, for fear they may have to imitate us in everything. The first thing philosophy promises us is the feeling of fellowship, of belonging to mankind and being members of a community. Being different will mean that abandoning of that manifesto. We must watch that the means by which we hope to gain admiration do not earn ridicule and hostility. Our motto, as everyone knows, is to live in conformity with nature. It is quite contrary to nature to torture one's body, to reject simple standards of cleanliness, and make a point of being dirty, to adopt a diet that is not just plain, but hideous and revolting. In the same way as a craving for dainties is a token of extravagant living, avoidance of familiar and inexpensive dishes betokens insanity. Philosophy calls for simple life, not for doing penance, and this simple way of life need not be a crude one. The standard which I accept is this: one's life should be a compromise between the ideal and the popular morality. People should admire our way of life, but they should at the same time find it understandable. Does this mean we are to act just like other people? Is there to be no distinction between us and them? Most certainly there is. Any observer should be aware that we are different from the mob. Anyone entering our home should admire us rather than our furnishings. It is a great man that can treat his earthenware as if it was silver, and a man who treats his silver as if it was earthenware is no less great. Finding wealth an intolerable burden is the mark of an unstable mind. But let me share with you, as usual, the day's small find, which today is something that I notice in a Stoic writer, Hecato. Limiting one's desires actually helps to cure one of fear. Cease to hope, he says, and you will cease to fear. But how, you will ask, can things as diverse as these be linked? Well, the fact is, Lucilius, that they are bound up with one another, unconnected as they may seem, widely different though they are, and two of them march in unison like a prisoner in the escort he is handcuffed to. Fear keeps pace with hope, nor does our so moving together surprise me. Both belong to a mind in suspense, to a mind in a state of anxiety through looking into the future. Both are mainly due to projecting our thoughts far ahead of us instead of adapting ourselves to the present. Thus, it is that foresight, that greatest blessing humanity has been given, is transformed into a curse. Wild animals run from the dangers they actually see, and once they have escaped them, worry no more. We, however, are tormented alike by what is past and what is to come. A number of our blessings do us harm, for memory brings back the agony of fear, while foresight brings it on prematurely. No one confines his unhappiness to the present. So that was The Philosopher's Mean by Seneca and his moral letters to Lucilius, of which he wrote quite a few as an instructor and tutor towards this young man who was in Sicily, I believe. I have to fact check that. But the impact that had on me, it turned my fundamental philosophy on its head as far as how I was to behave in public. And it makes a heck of a lot of sense when you get down to it, because when you're coming at people with radical thoughts, to them anyway, these might be rooted in wisdom in every religious tradition on the planet, but the modern person is ignorant to say the least, and all their arrogance wrapped up in science. He says, the very name of philosophy, however modest the manner in which it is pursued, is unpopular enough as it is. And we could ask ourselves, why would that be the case? Why are people so adverse to philosophy, especially a philosophy that Seneca professes, Stoicism? Because really, the only point of this philosophy, when you get down to it, is about living the good life, a happy life, a life of ease, a life that you can navigate without worry. You live in the moment. You don't put off your chores and your duties and your responsibilities, but you do put off hopes, anxieties, and fears. And that enables you to really relish what you do have. It's an incredible form of gratitude, and it's very powerful. Why are people scared of it? You'd have to answer that for yourself. I think a large part of it is Stoicism, by its nature, and a lot of philosophies advise you to put down your passions, advise you to put down your strong emotions, advise you to live in accordance with nature, which in a funny way is actually subverting it. And that's because we as people are very different than the animals say. And we'll get to that at the end. I like these other quotes. Let our aim be a way of life not diametrically opposed to, but better than the mob. All he's saying here is lead by example. And if you really want to help people with your philosophy, your ideas, anything of that nature, then it's very important that you don't turn them off right away to everything you're saying. Because as he said, we shall make them moreover reluctant to imitate us in anything, for fear they may have to imitate us in everything. And certainly Seneca's been heavily, heavily criticized, perhaps more than a lot of other philosophers, for maybe not living exactly in tune with what he professes in his letters to Lucilius and other writings. However, it's a fault that he mentions by himself and admonishes himself for, and I don't think we can fault him for that. My background, my punk rock philosophy, well, let's just say that I had a lot of friends that were in it for the accolades, and they dumpster dove, they lived a crust punk life, folk punk, crust punk. You're probably not familiar with those genres, but they do exist, and these people live like raccoons. They scavenge, they live on the floor, and their point is a rebellion against the system. However, it's exceedingly difficult for them to get their point across, as well sung as it might be, as well spoken as it might be, as well thought out as it might be, because you can't even stand 10 feet within these people without the smell about knocking you over. And they're hard to look at because they do embrace an anti-conformist attitude. So about everything they do flies in the face of normalcy. And well, I'll say, a year and a half ago when I was reading this, I was in a suburb of Minnesota and even riding my longboard around this suburban street, which was very prim and proper. It's where my parents live, etc. But that was enough to elicit people staring out their windows at me, taking pictures of me on their phone. People were very concerned. Who's this tattooed, bearded guy, on a longboard? This is Minnesota. We ride bicycles, etc., etc. So, needless to say, if I were to knock on any of their doors with a longboard and a book of Stoic philosophy, they would have shut me out almost immediately. So wrapping up here, he ends this with, we should cease to hope, and you will cease to fear. A lot of people will say, especially people that have watched way too many movies and way too much television, and there's a very separate history here that I'd love to get into one day, but you could say all we have is hope. And it sounds really nice. It sounds like you could get a lot of accolades and kudos from your neighbors. But ultimately, it's a horrible philosophy, because if you live in hope, you don't live in today. And if you're hoping for a change, hope isn't enough to motivate that change. Hope just exists. It's just there. So it's not good enough to motivate any sort of a change. And what Seneca does, and I love this stuff, because the last 2 years or so I've been heavily, heavily divested in learning psychology and neuropsychology, because it occurred to me that if I want to convey anything to the modern person, the modern Numa, shout out, it's going to be necessary for me to change my stance. And my stance is a classical one. And it's very much not one that is rooted in the accolades of modern science. In fact, I'm not even a huge fan of science because it warps people's ideas so much. It's an extremely useful tool. It's a very powerful method, and you can derive so much from it. And I have expanded my knowledge on philosophy, psychology greatly by trying to learn and understand neuroscience, which has been a hard road because I don't have a background in it. But check this out. He says, thus it is that foresight, the greatest blessing humanity has been given, that's true, that is very true, is transformed into a curse. Wild animals run from the dangers they actually see, and once they have escaped them, worry no more. I was on a backpacking trip with a friend last August, and we kept coming across this herd of cows, and these idiot cows would see us and spook, and then they'd run down and get out of sight. And as soon as we crested the next, I guess, valley is the best way to put it, or drainage, they would see us again, get spooked again, and run. And sure enough, over the next drainage, they'd be grazing, and then they'd see us, get spooked, and run. This could have gone on indefinitely. But here's the difference between people and all animals. And get that through your head. All animals. We're not, as much as people might like to compare us to the animals, and the comparisons can be extremely useful. The one thing we can do as people is detach our thinking from our doing. Animals can't do that. They act out exactly what they're thinking as they're thinking it. Our great gift is that we can simulate, which means we can project a future or an infinite variety of futures and potentially live them out. Maybe you've done this if you have been seeing someone and you're trying to determine if you're going to keep seeing them. Maybe you're projecting out a year, 2 years, 3 years. Maybe you are a freshman in college and you're taking your basic classes, and every time you look at a catalog, you're absolutely horrified because you're simulating all sorts of different futures. So you change your major 10, 20, 30 times, and you stay in college forever because you're too anxious about committing to one future. Well, the animals don't worry about any of this, and as soon as the danger is past, they relapse into a steady state. And so what Seneca is telling us is that this blessing of simulation is also our curse. Because if we live in hope or we live in fear, then we're not living right now in the moment. And right now is the only time we can actualize on a situation. So we can dream all day, but if we don't execute, it's entirely pointless. So I thank you very much for listening to this talk on Stoicism. That was Book 5 of the Moral Letters to Lucilius. It's sometimes called Letters from a Stoic. I like Moral Letters to Lucilius because at least Seneca's Stoicism was very much morality based, and that sense, the best way to live. If you have any comments, please leave them below. I'd love to hear from you. Always down to jam in the comments. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you soon.